Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Tonight's session is titled Winners and Losers in the History of Citizenship and the 14th Amendment. And I'm joined tonight by Martha S. Jones, Professor of History from Johns Hopkins University. My name is Andy Mink. I'm the Vice President of Education at the Center, and I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. Libby, Mike, and I are looking forward to a great 2020. We appreciate that you've contributed so much and spent much time with us this past fall, and we're looking forward to a really provocative, I think, webinar series as well as other activities. It's important for us to be able to respond to your interests and to your needs, and so please do keep in touch with us either by social media like our Twitter handles or email. Let us know if you have any problems with your documentation. Let us know if there are topics you'd like us to cover. Let us know if you'd like to give us feedback on the different activities and initiatives that we do at the center. The National Humanities Center is located in Durham, North Carolina, not far from Leslie Mace. It's a really special place, I have to tell you. It's a very serene and quiet space where a lot of violent intellectual activity happens. Every day we have a cohort of university professors who earn a fellowship and move to North Carolina and come to the center on a daily basis to do their work, and that includes the book that Martha wrote that tonight's webinar is based on. So if you're local, if you're nearby, if you're moving through the Triangle area in North Carolina, we always would invite you to come and stop by and visit with us. But really our education department is intended to connect this space and all the good work that goes there with you in the classroom. And so if you can't make it, if you're on the other side of the country, if you're in another part of the region, then it's through these virtual activities and through our face-to-face activities that we try to make those connections. You can find all of the work that we do on our website. We redesigned this past fall and made everything, all content that we've created searchable and a part of a larger index that includes recordings of our webinar series. And so if you move through tonight, if you're wrapped up in the conversation, if you'd like to go back and pause and linger on things, if you'd like to take sections of it and share it with your students, if you'd like to match it up with the PowerPoint, you can find, usually within about 48 hours, we like to post recordings of these live events, and you are more than welcome to use those. Again, you can find those in both the programs toggle on the navigation as well as the search bar. A couple of quick announcements in terms of our webinar series. I went tonight right before we went live, and I checked the attendance for the spring sessions. We have a few seats left in Akram Khader's session on understanding the modern Middle East, 72 at my last count. This was rescheduled from last fall, so it could be that some of you signed up for it, and if you did, we lost your registration when we transitioned it. So please go back and sign up. Again, there are a little over 72 seats available. And there's one seat, literally one seat available for our next webinar. Next week, we'll be working with Trevor Getz from San Francisco State University on the use of graphic novels in teaching the humanities and history. If you want that single seat, then open a window right now while I'm talking and go and sign up for it, and we'll reach our maximum of 200. I also want to note that our session with Johnny Smith from Georgia Tech has been rescheduled. I was originally on the calendar for December. We've moved that to the end of April. And starting tonight, if you attend 100% of the sessions that you register for, whether that's 1 or 10, we will invite you to a special VIP session at the end of the semester. In the spring, we'll be offering this bonus track webinar with Carolyn Denard from Georgia State. She's the founder of the Toni Morrison Society, and she'll be working with us on the life and writings of Toni Morrison. So please put all those dates in your schedule. We do ask that if something comes up and you can't join us for something you've registered for, to let us know or withdraw yourself. We keep a waiting list, and Libby's very diligent about putting folks into those empty seats once they appear. So it's always helpful for us and for the other folks in this growing network of educators. A couple other things I'd like to put on your calendar. That includes a summer institute that we're offering in July of 2020, titled The Contested Territory, America's Role in Southeast Asia, 1945 to 1975. These 10 days are intended to be a multidisciplinary look at not just the Vietnam War, but all the many layers historically, politically, culturally, socially, linguistically, artistically, all the layers that make the very complex fabric of Southeast Asia, and then have that um, uh, speak to America's role in the 1960s. Leslie Mace, who I appreciate the shout out there, was with us 2 years ago when we offered this. And if you're interested in joining us, please submit an application. You can find this on our website. They're due by March the 1st, and we will be limiting the Institute to 36. There is a $2,100 stipend that comes with this, this institute, so you'll be eligible for that if you're selected to attend. Our online courses are also opening. We have courses opening both this month and in March. These courses earn up to 35 professional development hours. So for many of you who are attending these webinars and really appreciating the CEU credit, one of these courses is worth about 5 of these webinars. And so if you're locked out for full, like Natalie just mentions, the comics webinar is full. You know, some of these online courses might be a good way for you to not only get those credit hours that you need, but also spend some immersive time and the different topics that we have available. And finally, if you are in Southern California, we'd love to have you come and join us in early March, March 6th and 7th, at the Huntington Library. The National Humanities Center Education Department is co-sponsoring and co-hosting a day-and-a-half workshop focusing on the use of museums and sites in the classroom. The session that we'll be leading focuses specifically on civil discourse. There is a limit of 70 attendees, and we're currently accepting applications. I think you can do that through the Huntington website. We'll be announcing and notifying those who are selected in mid-February. Mike, Libby, and I will all be there. We'd love to have you come out and introduce yourself and meet us at that point. Finally, I'd like to thank our Teacher Advisory Council, both our current and our alumni, for their continued hard work in making sure that we're relevant to what's happening in the classroom. I see many of them in the room tonight, including Rick Parker down in Atlanta, Marielle Herzog up in Illinois, and I very much want to thank them for all of their hard work with us. It really does help us to be connected with teachers who are standing in front of students, the current realities of working in schools and in classrooms, and we hope that the work that we provide, the bridges we provide, are useful for you in that process. Hey, there's Kevin Klein as well in Indiana. Kevin, by the way, thank you for asking Matt to join us. Kevin is one of our TAC members, and there's Jeff Nesbitt as well, and he invited a colleague to join because we were full. If any of you if we do reach that 200 person limit and you've got colleagues who'd like to join you, sit with you, sometimes we've had teachers arrange sort of after school times where they put the webinars on the projector and maybe 8 or 10 department colleagues sit in. We can absolutely send you certificates of attendance for all of you. Libby will work with you on that, and we'll take it as good faith that you're there and participating. So if you do get to that point that you'd like to sponsor almost a department-wide or a school-wide or a faculty-wide session, please let us know, and we'll get at least one of you in. That way you can facilitate it for the rest of you. A couple of reminders about tonight. You're so far using the chat box just as we intended to, which means you are chiming in, you're asking questions, you're making comments. Please do use that for not only communicating with me, but in responding to Professor Jones and the material she's sharing. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, if you'd like to share resources, please do use that chat box. And my job as the moderator will be to moderate that and be bringing those questions into our conversation. And I would encourage you to use that exclusively. So that's all really just a way to get us to this introduction. I want to thank Martha S. Jones for joining us tonight. Martha is a former fellow at the National Humanities Center. She was with us in 2013-14, and I'm very pleased to say that a good chunk of the work that she did for this book, Birthright Citizens, was done at the center. I'm going to make sure tomorrow to pass along her appreciation of our library staff and the rest of the center faculty. Martha, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here. Thank you, Andy.
Absolutely. And, you know, Martha, I'm not going to give away your location necessarily because it would really
Parlez
underscore the fact that this.
français, and we can give it all the way by doing the seminar in French if you'd like.
We can do it in French. Martha was so kind to join us tonight and do so from France, actually. So it's about a little after 1 a.m. her time. But it really, in some ways, leads me to the first question I'd like to ask as we sort of move into this webinar. And I'm going to give you the mouse and let you drive the conversation. But I'm really curious. You know, I actually saw you at AHA last week in New York, and I noticed there are a lot of people around you, and yet, you know, you're, in my mind, my imagination, you're answering the kinds of questions I imagine you also answering when you're overseas, when you're abroad, you're in places like France. And that is sort of the external view of what Americans think of as citizenship. What kind of questions do you get as the expert in this topic when you're, if not representing this topic elsewhere, but people see you as the person to go to? What do people outside of America think about this topic?
Well, I think there are two things, both of which I hope we'll get to in one way or another. The first is that students of U.S. history or people interested in U.S. history from outside the U.S. are very intrigued by a system in which we continue to work with a constitution that was written at the end of the 18th century. Which is to say, tonight we're going to talk about one of the major amendments to that Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which is ratified in 1868. But in many parts of the world, of course, constitutions have been repromulgated, written anew, expressly adapted for the 20th and the 21st century. And ours is a curious document in that we are continuing to work, in the case of the 14th Amendment, with a kind of 19th century solution to the question of national belonging. And we're trying to make it work in the 21st century with, as the title of the seminar suggests, with people who are sort of winners and losers in that sort of scheme. The other piece of it, of course, is that while birthright citizenship itself is not unique to the United States, it is the dominant regime of national belonging throughout the Americas. Here in Europe, most countries have a more hybrid scheme that relies upon both birth by the soil, birthright citizenship, but also birth by blood or parentage. And so I think both at home but also abroad, people have a lot of questions about why we would, if you will, stick with birthright citizenship here in the 21st century, when in at least important parts of the Western world, that scheme has been abandoned for other approaches to national belonging. So I spent a lot of time trying to translate that and a great deal more, frankly, of the US and how we got to be who we are. But birthright citizenship, as I'll talk about, is very much, if you will, in the news. And so it's a big question that I get.
That's fantastic. And if you don't mind me giving you just a quick follow-up, and Jeff Nesbitt notes that you sort of offhandedly use the phrase, ours is a curious document. And I'm wondering, from the first point you made, is it your sense that that is it the arrogance of the amendments in the Constitution that we think it can transcend time? Is there something more sinister? Is it like, why are we so stuck in that time capsule of how we use and interpret and apply that?
Yeah, well, I mean, on the one hand, we have managed across time to muster, if you will, the collective will to revisit the Constitution piecemeal. We have nearly 30 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So on the one hand, we could say, well, we have managed to do that. And so we do have the capacity, at least historically, to rethink at least discrete parts of this document. But because the bar is so high when it comes to amending the Constitution. The ratification of 2/3 of the states, for example, is required. That is a high bar and requires a wide and deep consensus among Americans that we might say in 2020 is difficult to imagine bringing into being. Now, for those of you who are interested in this process, I'd suggest tuning in to the renewed struggle to ratify an equal rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a goal that reaches back nearly 100 years in our history and has been renewed, and through that you can see this process of amendment unfolding, but you can also see how high the bar is and how tenuous a way it is to rethink policy, fundamental policy in this country. So while there's a lot of talk about birthright citizenship these days, I don't, at least at this moment, see the kind of political consensus and the collective political will that would let us come back to the question, for better or for worse, I guess I'd say.
Fantastic, thank you. I've given you the mouse, Professor. I'll let you sort of advance the slides at your own pace. Again, you can find either use the arrows on your keyboard or down in the lower left-hand corner.
Superb. Well, thanks so much, Andy. And I want to thank everyone at the National Humanities Center for bringing us together in this virtual way and a chance to talk about the work and the insights that I hope come out of Birthright Citizens. I am deeply indebted to the center, and folks should know the privilege of being a fellow at the center means indeed this sort of quiet retreat-like space in which to think and to write, expert support, including the librarian staff. And I have to mention that there's lunch every day. So should you have the occasion to come through, make sure you pass through at lunchtime and get an invitation, because the food is great. And for somebody like me who usually eats out of something plastic, sitting at her desk and working, it really was a special privilege to spend every day at lunchtime talking to remarkable colleagues and moving my own work forward. So I have great memories of the center, and I'm really grateful for everybody there for making it possible for me to talk with you. What we'll talk about today indeed does come out of this book I published in 2018 called Birthright Citizens. But the particular take I want to offer you on that book, which is a a fairly egghead legal history version of the story, the version of it I want to sort of talk through with you today is one that I developed in part last academic year, when I had the great privilege of working with teachers and students in my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland, at the Baltimore School of the Arts, which is our public performing arts high school. And each year at the Baltimore School for the Arts, the sophomore class develops from scratch its own performance pieces that draw upon early aspects of the city's history. It's a great way to teach history and to put it in the hands of young people and then ask them to make something out of it. So I was challenged in a way to teach material I had created for a specialist audience, and to then translate that for young people and to see what they might do with it. So remarkably for me, they were able to take this material and the character I'll introduce today, a gentleman by the name of George Hackett, and use that to create a series of really effective vignettes about early African American life and political culture, this striving around belonging and citizenship in the Civil War era. They were able to do that out of this book. And so that experience has really stayed with me and has really encouraged me to continue to think, if you will, in their framework about this, history that I had written. And so that's what I want to impart for you today as we talk. And alongside that, I think the other thing to say importantly as we start is that there's no way to talk about this subject in 2020 without first acknowledging that when it comes to the subject of birthright citizenship in the United States, we live in, I guess I'd put it, troubled times, right? We live in times where this very old provision in the 14th Amendment, one that dates back more than now 150 years as part of our regime, is really up for debate. And that debate is not only happening in, at kitchen tables or in classrooms. That debate is happening in some of the highest echelons of our system of governance, in the White House, in Congress, likely in our courts coming forward. So this has turned out to be a history that is deeply relevant to our own times, to understanding this debate in our own times. Some of you may have heard out of Washington, out of the White House, discussion about, I'll put it in quotes, repealing the 14th Amendment. I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like. But we've also heard commentators, for example, who doubted that Senator Kamala Harris from California doubted that she was eligible to be President of the United States early in her candidacy because she was the daughter of immigrants who were not themselves naturalized citizens. And in order to understand that, it's necessary to understand the 14th Amendment. If you want to get a sense of how unclear this question is in our own time, the U.S. Attorney General William Barr, when he was queried during his confirmation hearings about specifically about the law of birthright citizenship, said he had no views, which is maybe curious, but I think is more a sign, right, that Barr is aware that this is a question that is a hot one and that is subject to debate and perhaps even to change. I don't know where you all are in terms of geography, but it's true even where I live in Maryland today that the debate around birthright citizenship has seeped into the daily lives of people living in the United States. Certainly if you live anywhere in the near vicinity to the borderlands of the United States, in Texas, in Michigan, these are places in which ordinary people are oftentimes painfully aware that their citizenship and the force of birthright is up for debate and under scrutiny. So we have, friends and classmates, students, neighbors who carry now reams of documents and lawyers' phone numbers when they travel even domestically, because it is not so far-fetched that there will be a question about their citizenship and their right to be in the U.S. and remain in the U.S. And so when I'm asked about this, one of the things I'm able to say out of my own work is that it turns out in 2020 we don't have to imagine a country, our country, and what it would be like without the protection of birthright citizenship. It's not so distant a time in our past that without Birthright, there was a community of Americans, Black Americans, former slaves, who were subject to a kind of persistent question, a persistent doubt, and even in some cases a sort of daily fear and terror that someone in officialdom might question their right to be in this country and move to remove or deport them. So it turns out that this story is in some ways a window into our own times. And when I speak with general audiences, it is always the case, be it students or teachers or otherwise, or general publics, it's always the case that afterwards there is someone whose own family is very much acutely feeling this question in their own lives. So I say that to say this has been an important chapter in our history to teach, but it is a live one that many of the people I speak with are feeling the effects of even in the 21st century. So it's a hard history to tell, but I think still an important one. And you'll forgive me as I master the keyboard here on the slides. So I mentioned, George, sorry, Andy, did you?
No, I just wanted to make sure that you had the slide where you wanted.
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So I mentioned this character, George Hackett, who our students at the Baltimore School of the Arts became very fascinated by. And I want to use Hackett as a bit of a guide tonight for us to talk through some, I think, important but complex legal history. And it turns out that Hackett, who was born in 1807 and lives until 1870, his life is a sort of arc of the story that follows the story that I want to tell. And this slide is a shot of Hackett's burial marker in Baltimore City. He's buried here in 1870. As you can, I think, gather from the image in what is now a forgotten, largely forgotten and abandoned cemetery that has been relocated north and west of the old center city. And I start with this as a reminder, really as a sort of metaphor for the story that his life tells about the quest for citizenship for Black Americans. It's a somewhat neglected and forgotten one. So I appreciate the folks who did the trekking in the snow, as you can see in this shot, to find this marker and to document it. And I think of the book I'm going to talk from as very much in parallel tribute to men like Hackett. So Hackett's born in 1807 and lives to 1870, and he is in many ways a peer to a better known Black Baltimorean, that is Frederick Douglass. Douglass is born in 1818 and lives a long life until 1895. But unlike Douglass, who was born enslaved and as a young man becomes a fugitive from slavery, has to leave Maryland and Baltimore in order to secure his freedom, Hackett is born free to free parents in Baltimore City and is part of a growing, really a burgeoning community of free African Americans in that border state city, Maryland being a place that is between North and South, between slavery and freedom. And the dynamics that generates means that Hackett is not simply himself born free, but he's born into this growing, what will become the largest community of former slaves in the United States before the Civil War. He's born in Maryland just as the state is going to amend its constitution to disenfranchise African American men, that is, take away the vote from African American men. So Hackett's father, Charles, was a voter before 1810, and his son is born into a new era when Black men's political rights are being curtailed, are being cut back. The word white is introduced into the state constitution, marking a new era in the political life of a state like Maryland. But he will live to 1870, and 1870 is, of course, the year that the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. That amendment that looks to help guarantee to African American men, or we might say in the case of men in Maryland, restore to African American men the right to vote. So I hope even in that small bit you get a sense of why Hackett's life is so pertinent to this story, because it really does track this loss of voting rights and then the restoration of voting rights after the Civil War. And the thrust of Hackett's vision, what will emerge as his political vision over the course of his lifetime, was best captured, I think, by the profoundly eloquent minister and anti-slavery activist and journalist, writer, novelist, Martin Delany, another peer to Hackett and to Frederick Douglass. Delany will write, when reflecting on his own status and the status of former slaves in the United States, he'll write in 1852, we are Americans having a birthright citizenship. Our common country is the United States. Here we were born, here raised and educated. Here are the scenes of childhood, the pleasant associations of our school-going days, the loved enjoyment of our domestic and fireside relations, and the sacred graves of our departed fathers and mothers. Delany is really gathering his courage in this moment, because while he deeply believes himself and people like him to be a citizen of the United States, he has concluded that perhaps the nation will never acknowledge that. And so he is on the eve of planning to leave the United States, but he writes, we are Americans by virtue of having a birthright citizenship, natural claims upon the country, claims that are common to all of our fellow citizens, natural rights which may, by unjust laws, be obstructed, but never can be annulled. Delany believes that the U.S. Constitution, and even in 1852, guarantees him and people like him the status of citizen, but he also recognizes that lawmakers are reluctant, if not absolutely committed to denying Black Americans that status. And this is the quest that George Hackett commits himself to. But I'm a little bit ahead of myself. So I want to back up and talk a little bit more from the perspective of George Hackett himself. Hackett is part of a community, raised up in a community that is actively asking this question: who are we before the law? Who are we before the Constitution? And while these are men and women who are excluded, for example, from certainly sitting in legislatures and excluded from formal deliberations, are also excluded from the study of law, they do, it turns out, engage in the study of law using legal texts, using the pages of their newspapers, using African American led political conventions and public gatherings to teach themselves a version of the Constitution that they hope will aid them in this quest to be affirmed as citizens. And George's really first education happens at home around the family dinner table, if you will. His father, Charles, is an activist, someone who spends his life as a modest laborer during the day, but in the evenings and the weekends is a devoted activist in his local African Methodist Episcopal Church, where he is a deacon, where he will be the first to compile the church law and publish it for members of the Black Methodist community. He is an agent in Baltimore, someone who solicits subscriptions and distributes newspapers in Baltimore for Freedom's Journal, which is the very first Black published newspaper in the United States, beginning in 1827 out of New York City. So Charles Hackett, George's father, helps build schools. He frees enslaved ministers by purchasing their freedom. And he raises his son in this community of activism and meaning, but always with this question and this specter hanging over their heads about citizenship. And Hackett turns to the texts, the foundational texts, the US Constitution especially, looking for clues, looking for insights, looking for answers to his question about his belonging. Just like we pick up the Constitution today, some of you I know in anticipation of our getting together looked at the 14th Amendment. Well, men like Hackett are looking at the 1787 Constitution for clues. And interestingly, what they discover is that for the most part, the US Constitution is silent about who is a citizen. It makes only indirect allusions to citizens of the United States. It does distinguish between enslaved people and free people and Indians, but it never comments on formerly enslaved people, now free Black people, and who they are in relationship to the document. They notice that the Constitution of 1787 guarantees to citizens the privileges and immunities of citizenship, but it doesn't say who those citizens are. They're very intrigued by a little invoked requirement in the original Constitution, and that is the requirement that the president must be a natural born citizen. These men say, that's interesting. If the president is a natural born citizen, perhaps there is such a category. And if the president is a natural born citizen, why aren't we also born in the United States naturally, also citizens? There's no color line in the US Constitution. And I hope you can hear there the way in which their argument begins to come together. They begin to do their own interpreting of this somewhat obscure provision in the Constitution as a way of building an argument, building a claim to belonging. They also read the Maryland State Constitution, and any of you have tried to teach your students the principle of federalism and how it is that at all times in our history and in our present day civic life, we live pursuant to more than one constitution. It was true at the beginning of the 19th century that Black Marylanders lived pursuant to a Maryland state constitution as well. And they look at the text of that document, and what they find is more silence. That is to say, the Maryland state constitution does not at all address who is a citizen of the state or a citizen of the United States. And so the Hacketts find themselves in this with this burning question and a lot of silence in the nation's most important legal touchstones. It leaves room for many people to doubt them and to fill that space with doubt, but it also leaves them space to if you will, build a case for their own view about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to belong in the United States. And that is the work that Charles and George and men like them will do in the coming decades. You might be asking yourself, why citizenship? Why reach for that high bar at this time, especially when official documents appear to be so silent or ambiguous on the question? Well, the answer is that there are two very deliberate and deeply felt pressures that are bearing down on formerly enslaved people in this period. First is a political movement that we call colonization. And colonization is rooted in an older 18th century idea, really animated by the founders, the notion that slavery will end, that slavery may end in a matter of years or decades or even a century, but slavery will end in the new United States. And colonizationists believe that when it does, it's necessary to remove former slaves from the US to guarantee that going forward, the country will be, as some commentators would have put it, a white man's country. And so by the 18 teens, colonizationists have organized into the American Colonization Society, and they have raised funds, they have lobbied in legislatures, they have outfitted ships, founded the colony in West Africa of Liberia, and have appointed missionaries or agents who work among former slaves in communities like Baltimore and with people like the Hacketts, attempting to persuade them to give up their lives in the US and to relocate, perhaps to Canada, perhaps to the Caribbean, but certainly to Liberia in West Africa. And so colonization is the largest political movement of the early 19th century. It transcends regional lines and party lines, and gains a kind of momentum and force, and is animated by ideas that really install fear in the community that the Hacketts are a part of. And so they come to citizenship thinking that that might protect them from the pressures of colonization. It might be a way to resist the aims of colonizationists. If they are citizens, how could they be enticed or pressured or perhaps even forced to remove themselves from the United States, is the way their thinking goes. I said two pressures. One is colonization, and the second is what we come to call Black laws. And Black laws are statutes that emanate out of mostly state legislatures, like out of Annapolis in the case of the Hacketts. And these are laws that regulate everyday life in the of former slaves. What kind of property one can own, what kind of work one can do, can you travel, can you own a gun, can you have a dog, can you worship, in what kinds of configurations. Black laws aim to regulate the everyday lives and control the everyday lives of former slaves. And they do, so much so that they keep people both politically but economically and socially marginalized and at the bottom. And the Hacketts have a theory, which is that the Black laws are unconstitutional, that they are a deprivation of the privileges and immunities of citizens. And as a consequence, they hope that if they're able to make the case that they are citizens, that they can resist or have Black laws stricken from the record. So these two pressures, colonization and Black laws, are bearing down. But even as the Hacketts are asking this question, they're not alone. And so I want to offer a couple of examples of the ways in which, in addition to these, if you will, kitchen table and African American led debates about citizenship, learned, if you will, privileged men like the members of Congress are also wondering out loud who former slaves might be before the Constitution. So one example, in 1821, the state of Missouri is going to propose, or the territory that becomes the state of Missouri is going to propose to join the Union. And in order to do so, the state of Missouri has to present its own constitution to the United States, its constitution to the state of Missouri. And it needs to be reviewed and approved by Congress. And as Congress members review the proposed constitution in 1821, they find a provocative clause in that document. And it is a clause that provides that all former slaves, free African Americans, are barred absolutely from entering the new state of Missouri. And a debate ensues in Congress about this provision. Is it constitutional? Is it a violation of the privileges and immunities of citizenship for those Black people who would be barred from entering the state of Missouri? Is such a bar permissible by the Constitution? And the answer to that question depends on whether or not you think Black Americans are citizens of the United States. And it's a fascinating debate because it is clear that Congress members have thought about this question, and they've thought about it hard enough that they're able to take the floor and to hold forth, if you will, in dramatic fashion. But most fascinating for our purposes is that they really disagree. That is to say, there are those among members of Congress who argue that free Black people are citizens like white Americans, that there is no color line in the Constitution. And there are others who see no conflict and imagine or impose a color line on the Constitution and conclude that Missouri is at liberty to treat free Black people as it will. And most importantly, for people like the Hacketts, is that Congress leaves this question unsettled. It admonishes Missouri not to impinge on the rights of citizens on the one hand, but it lets the state keep this provocative provision in its constitution. And this is really the world that the Hacketts occupy, one in which again and again and again, lawmakers are unable to arrive at a conclusion, to fix their status, to settle the question of who former slaves are before the Constitution. And it will, over time, be a harrowing condition. So let me get back to George, because by the 1820s, George has begun a family. He marries in 1828. He begins his own work life, first as a waiter, and then he becomes a livery stable operator. He's ambitious, a budding entrepreneur, in fact. He experiences setbacks. His stable is washed out in a flood that kills many of his horses. He really can't get restarted. He's begun a young family, but his firstborn child, a son and a namesake, dies in infancy. And he really needs to start over. And he does something that was very common among free African American men throughout the years before the Civil War, is that he goes to sea. And he joins the crew, there we go. He joins the crew of this vessel, the USS Constitution. And if any of you are students of naval history, which I was not before I started this work, but I am now. The USS Constitution is a fabled vessel, old Ironsides, that earns its reputation during the War of 1812. But now in the 1830s is preparing to take a Pacific tour. And George signs on to be a steward to the Commodore of the Pacific Fleet. And he will spend many, many months in the Commodore's quarters as an aide to the Commodore Alexander Claxton. And he has this remarkable, intimate view of the inner workings of the Constitution by virtue of his position as the Commodore's steward. And I want to talk a little bit about what he learns there, things that he learns that help him to rethink this question of citizenship. The first is the itinerary of the Constitution. They go from Havana in the sugar colony of Cuba to Veracruz in the free independent city in Mexico, Rio de Janeiro to the capital of the Brazilian Empire and an active slave trading port in these years. And in each of these port cities, part of what George would have learned is that the questions that he's asking in Baltimore about citizenship and belonging are being asked everywhere in the Americas. It is the age of emancipation, as the historian David Bryan Davis puts it. That is to say, slavery is ending fitfully, unevenly, but it certainly is ending in much of the Americas. And as a result, everywhere in port cities in particular are these communities of people of color, like in Baltimore, who are present, who are working, building lives, building institutions, and are asking questions about who they are. And so he gets a kind of validation of the questions that have been being asked locally and begins to appreciate the magnitude of those questions. And the other thing that happens on the vessel is that citizenship is a live matter for American seamen. Hackett would have carried a small slip of paper, as would every man aboard the Constitution. He would have carried a small slip of paper called a Seaman's Protection Certificate that evidenced, that proved what? It proved that he was a citizen of the United States, and American sailors carried these certificates because they were thought to protect them from forced service or impressment by foreign navies, particularly the British Navy, which is notorious for this. So Hackett is carrying this proof that he is a citizen issued by US customs officials. And yet when he gets to a port city like Charleston, no one treats him like a citizen. In fact, he's treated nearly like an outlaw and is required to either stay aboard his ship or spend his time at port in jail. This ambiguity, this muddled state of affairs where he has an official document that says he's a citizen on the one hand, and yet state officials in South Carolina can treat him like a non-citizen and jail him without cause and without offense. Lots of lessons for a sailor about citizenship.
Thank you. May I ask you a quick question?
By all means.
Yeah, I was really interested in. I appreciate Robert and Kevin making some commentary on the points you were sharing as well in the chat box. But as you know, you started this by sharing your work in Baltimore with the school and the School of Arts. How did, in your memory, and if you can represent this well, how did they respond to the story of Hackett? Was there something about that vignette that really helped to illustrate the story for them working with younger students?
Yes, and there was a moment I sat in on rehearsals for the pieces that the students had composed. And there was for me a really chilling but defining moment when the young man who was playing the character of George Hackett turned to us and said, I don't understand why they've kept this history from us.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, right?
Yeah.
which is to say, for young people in my city, um, there's a lot that is said to them and about them, um, and yet they don't see themselves and their long history well represented in the pages of newspapers and on the nightly news. And what they knew was this story of Hackett, Hackett's quest for citizenship. Um, but the thing they found, I think, that opened the door, if you will, was that I shared with them Hackett's will. He writes a will at the end of his life, and he provides for the education of his young stepdaughter. He has remarried by then. His first wife has passed away. And they found um, not only his political work, um, but the intimate details of his life, right? Of family, his work, tough times, all of that turned out to be important to them in connecting to the bigger story, and really pushed me to recover more of those details and share with them those details that aren't in my book, right? Because that's not what legal historians are particularly interested in. But once I was able to engage them in the challenges of his life, and to generate their identification with him, then they really picked up on this bigger story.
I'm sure. Where did you find that, Will? And is it possible for anybody in our audience to also access it online or in a database?
You know, it's it's in the Maryland State Archives, and I don't
Yeah,
know if it's possible, Andy, to add it to the materials
we certainly can.
that we have, but I would love to share it, and
Yes.
because it's a beautiful primary document that speaks volumes about this man and how he saw his life and his life purpose. And that included ensuring that this girl, who he had come to parent, to
Mhm.
ensure that she would be well educated and cared for after his death.
Yeah, I will definitely do that, and I'll say to everyone in the audience tonight that in fact, I'll get Brooke and Andrade, our librarian, to find that for us, and we will distribute either a PDF or a link to it in the Maryland archives. Thank you. Um,
Superb.
while
Thank you
we've
for that.
while we've taken a pause, I also like to get to Pearlie's question.
Sure.
Uh, Pearlie asks, were the Seamen's Protection Papers mainly used by whalers of color in the U.S. and on the global high seas? She always associated these papers with whalers of colors.
The answer is all sailors take out seamen's protection certificates, and we have partial records, but good records, and can see that all men from all backgrounds and from all walks of life, yes, we associate them with whalers, men on merchant ships, but men in the Navy also are using them because sailors, black, white, and other, are all vulnerable to impressment, and so need and rely on protection certificates and throughout this period.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So last bit about that time on the Constitution, and that is that it turns out, and I didn't learn this until I myself spent time in the records of the Constitution and really get a feel for the day-to-day life on the ship. It turns out a naval flotilla and the head vessel, it becomes a kind of courthouse during a long tour. And so the other thing that George observes is a kind of up close a courthouse in the workings. And I don't have to draw out the details. You know what it means and what happens when sailors, after months at sea, get leave and go into port, all kinds of infractions, most of them having to do with alcohol, um, erupt. And as George watches these proceedings, he observes two important things. One is that in the Navy, black sailors can testify against the interest of white sailors, something that back in Baltimore is not possible in the state courts because black laws prevent black people from testifying against the interests of whites. The other thing he observes is that when white sailors, or when any sailor is convicted of a wrongdoing, they're likely to be flogged or whipped. And in Baltimore, only African American men are whipped when they are convicted of criminal offenses by the 1830s. It's a punishment that is so debased and associated with slavery that white men are excused from flogging in a city like Baltimore. And I mention those two details just to give you a sense of the way in which time in the Navy is really shifting George's perspective and showing him a different kind of legal order in which African American men stand in different shoes and indeed enjoy a kind of formal equality and a kind of authority that contrasts importantly to what he had until this point known in Baltimore. He leaves the Constitution and boards a whaler to get home. The Commodore has died. He disembarks in Nantucket and makes his way back to Baltimore City. And I find him there spending time in this place, which is the Baltimore City Courthouse. And this is really the next phase of Hackett's education and activist career. He's come back to the city. He's now an elder in the AME church. He's following in his father's footsteps. He is, I find him in the local courthouse in an extraordinary range of kinds of lawsuits. The first is a really simple one and a really ordinary one, which is he gets into a scuffle with a white man on the streets. And that's not unusual in Baltimore, but what's unusual is what he does with it, which is to say Hackett goes from the streets and into this courthouse and he sues this white man. He has him brought into court. He testifies against him at trial. He wins and goes home with $1 in his pocket, which is an ordinary fine. And while it's not a major civil rights victory, it is, I hope you can hear the way Hackett is beginning to chip away at the black laws and defy them, and discovers that in his local courthouse he can actually do more if he presses than the formal law would have him do. He's an elder, as I said, in the AME church, and he's regularly in this courthouse, again, representing his church community, defending it against speculators and predatory lenders who are looking to prey on black property holders, including those communities that own church properties. And he becomes a savvy agent here. He learns how to work with lawyers, but all along he learns how to protect this church, which is a potent symbol of African American belonging and the permanence of his community in the city. In these years, lawmakers are continuing to debate this question. Maryland rewrites its constitution, and at the end of the day, they can't figure out how to define people like Hackett, even though they know they exist, and they again leave him in limbo. High courts will wrestle with this question, most notoriously the U.S. Supreme Court in Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857, which will say that no Black American can be a citizen of the United States. Well, the next year in Maryland, the state high court will ask the same question. Can free African Americans be citizens of the state of Maryland? And the state of Maryland's courts say yes, they can, at least to the degree that they have the right to sue and be sued in the courts, as Hackett has been doing all those years. So even at high courts, you have this terrible, muddled state of affairs. Hackett's career shifts importantly in 1859 when Maryland proposes to enact what turns out to be a last set of very draconian black laws, known as the Jacobs Bill, named for the lawmaker who proposes them. And here, the state proposes two things. It proposes that free Black Americans should either be deported from the state, removed forcibly from the state, or they must submit to re-enslavement, as it's called. And here, free people of color would be required to, most of them, like Hackett, of course, be enslaved for the very first time in their lives. So George is, as you can imagine, vexed by this, as his entire community, now 75,000 free people of color throughout the state of Maryland. And he takes up a petition in Baltimore, circulates it, collects hundreds of signatures, and heads to Annapolis, the state capital. And there he, I think, is the very first Black American lobbyist in the history of the state of Maryland. He enters the State House, he confronts Curtis Jacobs, who was the proponent of the bill, and he speaks on behalf of, as he puts it, the 75,000 free people of color. He asserts that they have constitutional and legal rights, this old argument, right, that began with his father's generation and has continued through these years. He asserts constitution and legal rights, and argues to defeat this legislation, calls it, right, the great wrong and injustice ever done to free African Americans as a body. And he succeeds, which is to say the legislation is defeated in Maryland. And this is in contradistinction to similar legislation that had been going through the legislature in Virginia at the same time. In Virginia, these same laws will indeed be passed in 1859, and free people of color in Virginia will find themselves facing exile or re-enslavement. But through Hackett's efforts in 1859, free people of color will not find themselves in those circumstances in Maryland. Now, in most histories, this is where the story of citizenship actually and birthright citizenship oftentimes picks up. So I'm going to quickly just sketch what is the more familiar part of this story. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln's Attorney General Edward Bates will issue an opinion, a pamphlet, that concludes that, contrary to Dred Scott, contrary to the confusion of the prior decades, that free people of color are citizens of the United States. By 1866, immediately in the wake of the Civil War and Emancipation, Congress will legislate through the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and provide that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States, regardless of race, color, or previous enslavement. And of course, in 1868, the 14th Amendment will provide that all persons born in the United States are citizens of the United States, constitutionalizing this principle that Hackett and men like him have been advocating for over the many decades before. Now, if you've gotten even an inkling of Hackett and his character, what you won't be surprised about is that he's not sitting in Baltimore waiting for the Attorney General in Washington or Congress to declare him a citizen. He's long believed he is one. And in the wake of the Emancipation and the Civil War, he is at work actively comporting himself like a citizen of the United States. He will join the Republican Party and be a powerful advocate for voting rights for African Americans in the state of Maryland long before the 15th Amendment. He will come before the city officials, reminding them that Black Americans in Maryland pay school taxes and that their children up until this point have been excluded still from the public schools, and will win the establishment of public schools for Black children in Baltimore City. Right? The credit for those taxes finally being realized. He will head up one of the very first African American led militias in Maryland, and in fact in the country after the Civil War, the Butler Guard. He will join with many younger men who have served in the Union Army. They will don uniforms. They will openly carry firearms. They will gather information in the city streets, and they will claim, as Hackett has always done, that they are citizens, even as men in Washington continue to work out the discrete contours of what that might mean. Georgia attends in 1869 the first national so-called colored convention. African American leaders from throughout the country, free states, slave states, North, South, West, Midwest, all come to Washington, hundreds of them in 1869, to confer, to deliberate, to develop their own collective sense of what citizenship would mean. Hackett is there contributing to those debates, and then will be part of a delegation that will call on the new president, Ulysses Grant, and lobby Grant for the protection of their voting rights, the affirmation of their voting rights, lobbying for what becomes the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. Hackett is there continuing to see through the kind of quest to insist on an answer to the question that had been asked so many decades before. I mentioned at the beginning that he passes away in this year in 1870, and he I think regretfully, at least from this historian's point of view, misses the celebration of the ratification in 1870 of the 15th Amendment. In a sense of, I think, poetic justice, that celebration does not take place in Washington. It takes place in Hackett's home city of Baltimore. And it takes place here in front of that very same courthouse where Hackett had spent many, many years trying to cobble together, to eke out, to make the case in the way that he could that he was a citizen of the United States. In the plaza right here at Baltimore City's Battle Monument in front of the old courthouse is where that national celebration takes place. And men like Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, and many others will come to Baltimore to mark that occasion. Hackett has passed away in the intervening months since he had lobbied Grant for the 15th Amendment. But if you'll indulge me, I'm someone who likes to think that he certainly was there in spirit, someone who from wherever he was looking on was deeply moved and pleased to see a conclusion to his life's work being marked here in the city where he chose to make his family, build his community, but also engage in this long struggle for birthright citizenship. I have to think that he was in some way looking down and was extraordinarily pleased to see how that question had been resolved by 1870. So if it's okay, Andy, I think I'll stop there and hope that folks have comments and and questions, and that there are things we can talk about.
Absolutely.
But I appreciate the opportunity to share his story and to shed, I hope, some new light on this aspect of the 14th Amendment and the role that Black Americans played in putting the birthright principle into our Constitution.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'll give you a chance to take a sip of water and catch your
Sure,
breath.
no
And
problem, no
thank you for
problem at
sharing that
all.
narrative. Joshua has commented that it really is an incredible narrative. And as Sonia comments, we're consistently struck by how stories like this are omitted or at least undiscovered, if not omitted. I'm curious, particularly because we started by talking about your time at the center. As an historian, what kinds of evidence or sources did you use to construct this narrative? What were,
Yeah,
just generally speaking, what were the tools of your work?
absolutely. So I was very lucky because the state of Maryland has preserved much of the records of the old courthouse. And so I began there, um, really just curious about what Black Americans might have been doing in that courthouse. That's how I discover, if you will, Hackett for myself. But I discover he's one of dozens and hundreds of Black Americans in Baltimore City who are using the courthouse in similar ways. So I begin there, and that is the core of this study, trying to explain the meaning of what's going on in these kind of everyday encounters in the courthouse. I mentioned the colored convention movement, and there's a wonderful website that collects the proceedings of those conventions. It's coloredconventions.org, I think.
Okay.
Um, and the Colored Conventions Project has pulled together the records of dozens and dozens of these conventions in which we can peek in and listen to men like Hackett. His father is there in the early iterations. He's there later. We can listen to them deliberating on this question and debating it and strategizing around it. So I use those very importantly. The last thing I want to mention, though, is that when I was at the Humanities Center, I hadn't yet had time to think about this. What I had read was this claim that Hackett had been in the Navy. And I don't know, I guess I didn't know enough about the Navy to think about it seriously, but time at the center really let me do that. Um, and it was the librarians at the center who found the letters of Commodore Claxton, which are a small bit of them that are held at the University of North Carolina in the archives. And Brooke Andrade got me digitized copies of those letters. And there is a mention of Hackett, who is, in the Commodore's words, toting his Madeira wine because wine is very important on these long voyages. I have to tell you, it's not a casual matter at all. But there's Hackett in the Commodore's letters, and that was a light bulb went on, and that sent me to the National Archives and the records of the Constitution, and helped me to be able to recover the fullness of this journey. So it really is a piecing together and a linking together of a lot of disparate sources.
Fantastic. Kevin Klein from Indiana makes a comment about and suggests actually that we really spend time with some of the background articles that you shared in particular because of the connection to other nationalities, especially the children of Chinese immigrants. Can you comment
Yes.
on that? What are your thoughts about that connection?
Yes, it's such an important one, and thanks for reminding us all about that. Because one of my takeaways from this study was to recognize that U.S. citizenship has never been defined through kind of sober, learned, leisurely study and deliberation. Our citizenship has always been defined and redefined through crisis, oftentimes um, through consternation around communities of the despised. And I think it's fair to say before the Civil War that Hackett is part of not a uniformly, but a widely despised community in the United States. And unfortunately, the next chapter in this story of U.S. citizenship is that of Chinese immigrants and their children, who even as they are born in the United States, are regarded by many, even those in officialdom, to not be citizens of the United States, to be, sorry, I'm going to flip my slide if I can figure it out.
You know what, I got to stick that off. There you go.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Who are deemed to be so indelibly foreign that they cannot be incorporated into even a birthright citizenship regime. And Wong Kim Ark is the gentleman who will take that question all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it takes that much for the children of Chinese immigrants who themselves are not citizens, but whose children are born in the U.S. It takes going all the way to the Supreme Court to resolve that question. And so we see yet a second example of a despised community that faces a challenge to their belonging.
Yeah, I should comment too that we had a webinar with Erica Lee from University of Minnesota.
Well, this is everything I know about this question I learned from Erica Lee. So I commend you to her and to her work, because she has really taught us about the way in which the story of Wong Kim Ark, though it's best known through a Supreme Court decision, like Hackett's story is best known through Dred Scott, that there is a lived experience, right, of human beings, lives that are being torn apart and terrorized in this era of Chinese exclusion, and leads someone like Wong Kim Ark, who is undoubtedly a U.S. citizen, to face detention and harassment and more.
Well, she actually mentioned you in her webinar, and so I would encourage any of our participants, if you'd like to follow up on the Chinese American experience. Mid-December 2019, we recorded that webinar, and it is in our archive, and I'd encourage you to go back and look at that. A couple other questions before we're done tonight. As I hear you describe this, and I think this is more than semantics, but would you describe, Professor, that birthright citizenship is about defining exclusion or inclusion? Are we trying to figure out who's a citizen or who's not?
Well, at its inception, there's no question but that birthright citizenship is a principle that is intended to include. It very purposefully and deliberate. It originates out of Congress's desire to incorporate 4 million formerly enslaved people, 500,000 formerly free Black people into the national body politic. Right? It is a radical gesture of inclusion, and even more so, the language is open enough so that it now extends citizenship to all persons born in the United States, resolving many sorts of doubts that might linger, be it for white Americans, for Chinese Americans, and otherwise. So it is a radically democratic gesture of inclusion, and yet we recognize how it has been transformed to some important degree in our own time into an instrument of exclusion, right? That it's not enough birthright in the dynamics of a 21st century set of global migrations and pressures around migration. Birthright doesn't do all that we need, some would argue, when it comes to national belonging.
Jamie Beck out in Three Rivers, California asks, to your knowledge, are there any living descendants of George Hackett?
Not that I'm aware of. Thank you for asking that. I will say, though, that his stepdaughter, Henrietta, who he so carefully and lovingly provides for in his will, goes on to have a remarkable life, just as he'd hoped. She has a professional career as a singer. She performs and travels, and to good reviews. But she, by the 20th century, will take up politics. and will become an activist in Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, a 20th century Pan-African political movement led by the Jamaican national Marcus Garvey. Henrietta Vinton Davis will become the head of that movement when Garvey himself is prosecuted and deported. Henrietta Vinton Davis will step up and lead that political movement. And she doesn't have children of her own, but I like to think of her as very much living a life in the spirit that Hackett had bequeathed to her.
Last question goes to Pearlie Peters. If you can, Martha, can you position the whole birtherism fury that surrounded President Obama and his citizenship in your research?
Sure. Which it really goes back to the earlier point, which is that citizenship and even birthright, constitutionalized as it is a political question in our country and has in every generation been buffeted about in response to not legal exigencies, but political exigencies. When President Obama, there are deeply specious claims that undergird the questioning of President Obama is born in the state of Hawaii and is a birthright citizen. It's not even a hard question in a legal sense, even as it might be good political fodder for some. But there are other people. Right now, the people of American Samoa are in the midst of litigation because they are not birthright citizens, even though they are born in the territory of the United States. They are by law deemed to be U.S. nationals rather than birthright citizens because they are born in a territory and not in the 50 states. And they have been regularly in our courts, some of them veterans, elderly veterans now of the Second World War, who insist that they are birthright citizens rather than U.S. nationals. And so there are Americans for whom this is a live question and who are still struggling over the kinds of questions that Hackett posed a very long time ago.
Martha, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We often say that these webinars have an advantage of all of us being able to do it from the comfort of our own home and in our pajamas, but I have a sense that this might be particularly true of you tonight. Thank you for being up in the middle of the morning.
Thank you.
Thanks again. So please come and see us at the center. Thank you for your time tonight.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
And I'd like to thank all of our participants tonight for joining us tonight's webinar series. Again, the recording for tonight's session will be posted within about 2 days or so. Actually, it might be early next week. Please visit our website and you can have access to that as well as the materials and the PowerPoint. I'll also make sure that we research and find the George Hackett will, and we'll distribute that to you from the emails you used to register. Take a look at our website. Please follow us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can have updates for all of our upcoming activities. Please go ahead and apply if you'd like to join us in the summer for some of our work. And hopefully we'll see you again soon in some of those. Our next webinar is scheduled for January the 15th. I suspect that the one seat remaining for Trevor Goetz's session titled Disciplining Comics, Teaching in the Humanities with Graphic Histories has likely been taken, but we often have folks who have something come up at the last minute. So email Libby Taylor if you'd like to be added to the waiting list. If you can't make it, then take a look for the recording a few days later. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. In just a moment, I'm going to open the survey that we'll ask you to complete. And once that's completed, you'll be able to download your certificate of attendance. Have a great day at school tomorrow. We'll see you next time with the National Humanities Center Humanities in Class webinar series. Good night, everyone.